I still feel the scalding heat on my face when I close my eyes. The thick, spicy gravy sliding down my cheeks like molten shame, stinging every pore, the sharp tang of cayenne filling my nose until I could barely breathe. It soaked into the pale lavender silk I had spent 3 nights hand-stitching, tiny seed pearls now floating in the mess like lost tears. But the real burn, the one that seared straight through my chest and lodged behind my ribs, came from the words that followed. Evelyn Harrington, my son's new mother-in-law, looked me dead in the eye, wiped her manicured hand on a linen napkin as if she had touched something filthy, and said with that slow, honey drawl, "That's exactly what you get for thinking you belong here." The entire ballroom at the Ritz-Carlton in Charlotte went dead silent. 200 guests in black tie and couture froze, forks halfway to mouths, champagne glasses hovering, the low murmur of polite laughter dying like someone had flipped a switch. The air smelled of orchids and money, and now the sharp, briny stench of shrimp bisque dripping from my chin onto the marble floor. And then my son, my Marcus, the little boy who used to fall asleep clutching my skirt while I sewed late into the night, stood up from the head table, adjusted his platinum cufflinks with fingers that never trembled, and said, calm as Sunday morning after church, "She's right, Mom. You brought this on yourself." I felt something inside me crack wide open, a soundless shatter that echoed louder than any scream I could have let out. My sweet boy, the one I had rocked through fevers, the one I had taught to tie a tie with trembling 4-year-old fingers, the one who used to whisper, "I love you" to the moon and back every single night, he just stood there and let them drown me. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. My eyes burned worse than my skin, but I refused to give them tears. I reached for the napkin on my lap with hands that somehow still worked, pressed the soft cloth to my scalded cheeks, tasting salt and spice and betrayal, and stood. My knees knocked together under the table, but I locked them, straightened my spine the way I had straightened 1,000 crooked hems, and walked out of that room with my head high while the bisque cooled into a sticky mask on my skin. Before I reached the double doors, I slipped my phone from my clutch with fingers that still smelled of cayenne, dialed the number I had saved 6 weeks earlier under a fake contact name, and whispered the 3 words I had rehearsed in the dark 100 times. Do it now. If this story already has your stomach twisting, stay with me. If you've ever felt your heart crack open because the person you loved most looked you in the eye and chose someone else, subscribe to the channel right now. You're not alone, and there are more stories coming that will remind you exactly how strong you really are. My name is Loretta Hayes. I'm 58 years old, though some mornings I feel 80 and others I feel 35, depending on how heavy the night was. For 28 years, I ran a little alterations and custom gown shop on South Boulevard, right under my second-floor apartment in the historic part of Charlotte. The sign out front just says Loretta's Alterations in faded gold script. Nothing fancy, just me, my old singer that hums like a faithful friend, bolts of satin and lace stacked floor to ceiling, and women who needed to look beautiful for the most important days of their lives. I measured brides while they cried about cold feet, pinned hems while grandmothers told me about weddings in 1962 when gloves were still required, let nervous mothers of the groom try on dresses and whisper fears they couldn't tell their own daughters. My hands were always busy, my heart usually full, and the smell of fresh coffee and starch hung in the air like a promise that tomorrow would be better. Marcus grew up in the back room of that shop, doing spelling words on a folding table while the steady thump-thump of the sewing machine sang him to sleep. When his daddy walked out with nothing but a duffel bag and a goodbye that never came, I knelt in front of my 4-year-old boy, looked dead in those big brown eyes, and promised 2 things. Mama will always be here, and we will always have enough. I kept both promises, even when my fingers bled from pins, even when the lights flickered because the electric bill was late, even when I turned down dates and vacations and new shoes so he could have cleats that fit and books that weren't borrowed. I poured every dime into private school tuition and college applications until he graduated UNC Chapel Hill debt-free, landed a job in commercial real estate downtown, and still came home every Sunday for my smothered pork chops, kissing my cheek and saying, "Mama, you're my hero." Those words were oxygen. I lived on them. Then he met Juliet Whittemore. She was 26, blonde, polished like a magazine page, the only daughter of Dr. Evelyn Harrington, old Charlotte money, president of the Myers Park Country Club, the kind of woman whose smile never reached her eyes, and who could make "bless your heart" sound like a death threat wrapped in silk. The first time Marcus brought her to the shop, the late afternoon sun was slanting through the front window, catching on the dust motes and the sequins I had scattered across the cutting table. Juliet stepped over a box of French lace like it might bite her, smiled with teeth only, and said in that super sugar drawl, "Mrs. Hayes, Marcus says you're a miracle with a needle. We'll definitely need you for alterations." The way she said Mrs. Hayes landed like a slap, formal, distant, already putting me in the servant column. I felt the tiny fracture start right then, a hairline crack in my heart I pretended wasn't there. Still, I smiled because I wanted my son happy more than I wanted my pride. 2 months later, he announced they were engaged. Juliet wanted the wedding at the Mint Museum uptown, reception at the Ritz-Carlton, 12 bridesmaids, string quartet, orchids flown in from Hawaii, the works. Evelyn swooped in like a hawk and took over every detail. Invitations went out with both families' names, but somehow mine was smaller, lower, tucked beneath the Whittemore-Harrington crest like an afterthought. When I asked about the rehearsal dinner, Evelyn laughed that light, tinkling laugh that didn't fool me for a second, and said, "Oh, Loretta, darling, it's just immediate family and the wedding party. We didn't want to overwhelm you with all the fuss."
Marcus never corrected her. He just looked at his shoes. The first real crack came the day they picked the cake. Evelyn insisted on a 6-tier masterpiece from Amelia's Bakery. $4,800. Fondant so perfect, it looked plastic. When the invoice came, Marcus texted me while I was pinning a hem. "Mom, can you cover half? I'm short this month." My stomach dropped, but I transferred the $2,400 from the savings I kept for shop rent and new equipment, the money I had been guarding like a dragon. He never mentioned it again, never said thank you, never paid it back. I told myself it was a gift for his happiness. Then came the dress fitting. Juliet had chosen an $18,000 Vera Wang with a cathedral train that pooled like liquid moonlight. The boutique on Providence Road called me personally. "Mrs. Hayes, Juliet says you're the only one she trusts with the alterations." My heart leapt. I closed the shop for the day, ironed my best Sunday dress, the navy one with the lace collar I had made myself, and showed up with my pincushion, measuring tape, and a fragile bubble of hope floating in my chest. Evelyn was already there, perched on a velvet chaise like a queen, sipping champagne with 3 of Juliet's sorority sisters whose laughter rang like breaking crystal. Juliet spun out of the dressing room, and for one breathless second, she was every bride I had ever helped. Radiant, nervous, beautiful. The gown was stunning, but the bodice gaped slightly under the arms, and the hem dragged 2 inches too long on her petite frame. I knelt on the carpet, mouth full of pins, the familiar smell of new satin and nervous perfume filling my lungs, and said gently, "Sweetheart, we can take the bodice in just a 1/2 inch each side and lift the hem so you don't trip. You'll float instead of swim in it. Trust me, you'll feel like you're walking on air." Silence fell hard. I heard the champagne bubbles pop. Evelyn set her flute down hard enough to crack the delicate stem. "Loretta, the dress is perfect as is. Juliet doesn't need alterations from someone whose idea of couture is prom season at the mall." The girls tittered behind their manicured hands. Juliet's cheeks went pink. She looked at her mother, then at me, kneeling on the floor like hired help, then back at the mirror, and said nothing, not one word in my defense. I stood slowly, pins still clenched between my teeth, feeling every one of my 58 years settle on my shoulders like wet wool. "Of course," I managed, voice steady even though my heart was splintering. "Whatever the bride wants." That night, Marcus called while I sat in the dark of my apartment, the ruined hope sour in my mouth. "Mom, Evelyn says you embarrassed Juliet in front of her friends. Can you just let them handle the wedding stuff, please?" I swallowed every word I wanted to scream, every reminder of the blood and sweat I had poured into giving him the life that let him stand in rooms like that, and whispered, "Of course, baby." The exclusions got worse, each one a paper cut that bled a little more. No invitation to the engagement party at the Myers Park Country Club, I found out from the society page. No seat at the bridal luncheon. When I asked Marcus why I wasn't on the list for the couple's shower, he sighed like I was a child asking for candy before dinner. "Mom, it's mostly Juliet's parents' friends. You wouldn't know anyone. It'd just be awkward." Awkward. That was the word he chose for erasing his mother. I knew I was being slowly, carefully erased, one invitation at a time, one dismissive comment at a time, until there would be nothing left of me in his new, shiny life. Then, 6 weeks before the wedding, a manila envelope arrived at the shop. No return address, just my name, typed in plain block letters. The mailman handed it over with a curious glance. I locked the door, turned the open sign to closed, and sat at my cutting table surrounded by bolts of ivory tulle and lace that suddenly looked like funeral shrouds. Inside were photographs, grainy but unmistakable, printed on cheap copy paper that curled at the edges. Marcus and Evelyn. In the dim orange light of the Weston parking deck downtown. Her hand flat against his chest, fingers curled into his lapel. His mouth on her neck, her head thrown back in a laughter I could almost hear. Another photo showed them leaving Suite 2412 at 2:14 a.m., the timestamp glowing red like an accusation. A third, Evelyn slipping a thick envelope into Marcus's jacket pocket outside his office building on Tryon Street, her lips brushing his ear as she whispered something that made him smile the way he used to smile only at me.
My knees gave out. I slid off the stool and sat hard on the linoleum floor, photographs scattering like playing cards around me. The air smelled of starch and lavender and the ghost of every Sunday dinner we'd ever shared. My chest hurt so bad I thought I was having a heart attack. My son, my only child, the boy I had carried alone, raised alone, loved with every beat of my heart, was sleeping with his fiancée's mother. Everything clicked into place with a sickening snap. The way Evelyn's hand lingered too long on his arm at dinner, the private jokes that made him flush, the way Marcus flinched whenever I asked why he never brought Juliet around anymore, the money he kept needing, the distance that had grown between us like a canyon, the shame in his eyes when he thought I wasn't looking. I hired a private investigator the very next morning, before the sun was fully up, before I had even wiped the tears that had dried stiff on my cheeks. His name was Calvin Reed, former CMPD detective, quiet voice, kind eyes, that had seen too much. We met in a diner off Freedom Drive where nobody would recognize me. 2 weeks later, he slid a flash drive and a folder thick enough to stop a bullet across the Formica table. Hotel keycard records, 23 nights at 4 different hotels over the past 14 months, always the same 2 names on adjoining rooms or the same suite paid for by Evelyn Harrington. Bank records, $87,000 in transfers from Evelyn's personal account to Marcus's, labeled consulting fees or sometimes just gift. A lease agreement for a furnished 2-bedroom condo in South Park, paid in full for 2 years by Evelyn Harrington, title in Marcus's name only. And the worst, an audio file. I listened in Calvin's office with the door locked and the blinds drawn, the smell of old coffee and cigarette ghosts thick in the air. Evelyn's voice came through the tiny speaker, low and seductive, the same voice that had called me darling while planning my erasure. After the wedding,
Juliet gets access to the trust on her 30th birthday. That's only 18 months away. We wait. One unfortunate accident. A fall down the stairs, a car crash, too many pills mixed with wine, and every dime goes to her devoted husband. Then you and I disappeared to the house in Nassau I already bought. No more pretending. Marcus's voice, hoarse, almost pleading. I don't want Juliet hurt. Evelyn laughed, soft and cruel. You want the money or not? Because without me, you're still the broke little boy from South Boulevard whose mama sews for tips. I stopped the recording with fingers that finally shook. Something inside me had gone very cold and very still, like the moment before a storm breaks. All the love, all the sacrifice, every sleepless night bent over that sewing machine. It had been traded for hotel rooms and hush money and a plan to murder an innocent girl. I hired a private investigator the very next morning, before the sun was fully up, before I had even wiped the tears that had dried stiff on my cheeks. 2 weeks later, he slid a flash drive and a folder thick enough to stop a bullet across the Formica table. The reception was everything money could buy. Orchids flown in from Hawaii, dripping from crystal vases, a 10-piece band playing strings so sweet they made my teeth ache, champagne fountains bubbling like lies. They put me at table 19, near the swinging kitchen doors where waiters rushed past with trays of lobster and contempt. The cousins I'd never met spent the meal asking if I was the help, and whether I could let out the hem on one of their dresses real quick. I waited, sipping water I didn't taste, watching the clock above the bar tick closer to the moment I had rehearsed in my head every night for weeks. Dinner came and went. The first dance, Marcus spinning Juliet under lights that turned her gown to liquid starlight. The father-daughter dance, Dr. Harrington looking stiff and proud. Then the band struck up A Mother's Prayer, and the MC announced with syrupy warmth, "And now the groom and his beautiful mother." Marcus walked over, offered his hand like he was doing me a favor, his palm cool and unfamiliar. "Mom?" We moved onto the floor while cameras flashed and guests cooed at the sweet moment. The scent of his cologne, something expensive Evelyn had chosen, made my stomach lurch. Halfway through the song, I leaned close to his ear, close enough to feel him stiffen, and whispered, "Suite 2412 at the Westin, March 14th. You checked out at 2:17 a.m. She paid for the room with the same credit card she used to lease your South Park condo." He stumbled, his hand tightening painfully on mine. The smile froze on his face like a cracked mask. I kept my voice soft, sweet, for all the cameras. "I know about the trust. I know what she told you to do to Juliet after the honeymoon. I know every dirty dollar." "Mom!" The word cracked in his throat. "Smile for the cameras, baby," I said, beaming like any proud mother, while my heart bled out on the dance floor. "We're live streaming to 300 guests." Evelyn saw us from the head table. Her eyes narrowed to slits. She rose like a shark scenting blood, glided over in heels that clicked like gunfire, and tapped Marcus on the shoulder with one perfectly manicured finger. "May I cut in? Loretta must be tired." The song wasn't even over. Marcus stepped back without a word. Evelyn took his hand, then turned to me with that society smile, sharp enough to cut glass. "Loretta, darling, why don't you sit down? You're flushed."
She signaled a waiter with one flick of her wrist. Before I could move, a bowl of shrimp bisque appeared in her hand like a weapon. She flung it, full force, into my face. The heat was immediate, blinding. Shrimp clung to my eyelashes. The thick gravy slid down my neck in slow, humiliating rivers. Gasps rippled outward like a stone dropped in still water. Phones came out. Someone screamed. I stood dripping while Evelyn announced, loud enough for every microphone in the room to catch it, "That's exactly what you get for thinking you belong here." Marcus didn't move to help me. He just stared at the floor, shoulders hunched like the weight of the world had finally settled where it belonged. I wiped my eyes with the sleeve of my ruined dress, tasting salt and cayenne and the bitter end of 28 years of motherhood, and walked straight to the exit. The marble was cold under my heels, each step echoing like a heartbeat. My phone buzzed 30 seconds later. Unknown number. I answered in the quiet hallway that smelled of lilies and panic. "Mrs. Hayes, this is Sergeant Monroe, CMPD Financial Crimes. We're at the Whitmore estate with warrants for Evelyn Harrington's arrest. Fraud, conspiracy to commit murder, the works. We also have uniformed officers en route to the Ritz-Carlton to take your son into custody for questioning. The DA wants to talk to you tonight." I closed my eyes, felt the last piece of my heart break off and float away. "Thank you, Sergeant."
I hung up, walked back into the ballroom just as 6 uniformed officers entered through the main doors. The band stopped mid-note. Champagne glasses trembled in nervous hands. Evelyn saw them first. Her face went the color of spoiled milk, lips opening and closing like a fish drowning in air. Juliet started crying, high and broken. "Mama, what's happening?" Marcus looked at me across the room, pleading, terrified, the little boy I once knew flickering behind the eyes of a stranger. I met his gaze and mouthed the words I had waited weeks to say, the words that tasted like ash and freedom. "You chose." They cuffed Evelyn in front of the ice sculpture, while guests filmed on their phones, diamonds flashing under the chandeliers like cold stars. Marcus went quietly, head down, hands behind his back, the tuxedo jacket rumpled now, the shine gone. Juliet collapsed into her father's arms, her beautiful gown pooling around her like spilled milk. I walked out with bisques still drying and stiff patches on my skin, the smell of cayenne clinging to my hair, and my head held high because that was all I had left. And it was enough. The video went viral before I reached my car. #Soupgate, #mother-in-law from hell, #groom cheats with MIL trending nationwide by morning. Strangers sent me flowers. News vans camped outside my shop. Brides called from 3 states away wanting the woman who survived the bisque wedding to alter their gowns. 2 years later, I'm 60 now. The shop is still open, busier than ever, the walls lined with thank you cards and photos of brides who say I gave them courage. I bought the whole building outright last year with the reward money from the insurance fraud case tied to Evelyn's shell companies. Turns out the Harrington fortune was smoke and mirrors held together by lies. Evelyn is serving 12 years at the North Carolina Correctional Institution for Women. No parole. Her medical license revoked. The mansion foreclosed. Her husband filed for divorce from a rehab facility in Arizona and never looked back. Marcus served 11 months in minimum security for conspiracy to commit fraud. He got out 3 months ago. Works construction now, swinging a hammer from dawn to dusk. Lives in a 1-bedroom off Central Avenue that smells like new paint and regret. Sends me a card every holiday. Simple ones from the dollar store. His handwriting shaky but determined. I read them. I keep them in the drawer with his baby pictures. I haven't answered yet. Some wounds take longer than others to scab over. Last week he stood outside the shop after closing. Just stood on the sidewalk in the golden evening light, work boots dusty, looking at the window display the way he used to when he was 8, and waiting for me to lock up so we could go home and eat spaghetti by candlelight when the power was cut. I saw him from inside, silhouetted against the streetlights coming on one by one. Our eyes met through the glass. He lifted one hand, not quite a wave, more like a question. I lifted mine back, palm open, fingers trembling just a little. That was enough for now. I still drink my coffee every morning from the same chipped mug I've had since he was in diapers, faded blue with a crack down the side that I refuse to throw away. Some things you don't replace. Some things you carry until the weight stops feeling like punishment and starts feeling like proof you survived. I learned that real love doesn't always look soft. Sometimes it looks like letting someone fall so hard the only way left is up. Sometimes it looks like walking away covered in soup with your dignity intact and your heart in pieces. Sometimes it looks like silence when every part of you wants to scream. And sometimes healing looks like opening the shop at 9, smiling at the first nervous bride of the day, breathing in the smell of fresh coffee and new beginnings, and knowing deep in your bones that you survived. You won. Not because you destroyed them, but because you refused to let them destroy you. If this story hit you somewhere tender, leave me a comment and tell me where you're listening from. Have you ever had to choose between love and truth? Between protecting someone and protecting yourself? I read every single one, and your stories keep me going. And if you want more real-life stories that remind us we are never as alone as we feel, subscribe to the channel. There's a new one coming next week, and I saved you a seat right here with me. You're stronger than you know. Never forget that.